The Court of Power and Prejudice. The grand oak-paneled courtroom hummed with the quiet urgency of legal proceedings, a place where lives were decided with the flick of a gavel. The morning had moved along as expected, cases being heard, motions filed, justice, at least in its technical form, being served. At the highest bench in the room sat Judge Carlton Prescott, a man whose mere name carried weight in the state's judicial system. He had been presiding over cases for nearly 30 years, and in that time, he had made it clear that his word was final. His was a courtroom where tradition reigned, where he held the power of law in his wrinkled hands, and where he tolerated little deviation from the norm. And today, his patience was already wearing thin. The docket had been moving smoothly until she walked in. A woman in a tailored charcoal gray suit strode through the double mahogany doors with an air of unwavering confidence. Alexis Monroe. Her name commanded as much respect as her reputation, though neither seemed to reach the ears of the judge, who barely glanced up at her arrival. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor with a sharp rhythm, each step precise, each movement controlled. She exuded authority, yet Judge Prescott barely spared her a glance before exhaling sharply. "Next case," he grumbled, adjusting his glasses as he barely looked at the paperwork before him. "Who do we have?" The court clerk, a nervous man with round glasses that kept sliding down his nose, cleared his throat. "State of Georgia v. Wallace Denslow, Your Honor." Alexis approached the plaintiff's table, setting down her leather-bound briefcase with an air of finality. She had been in courtrooms like this before, with judges like Prescott, but she had never once let it shake her. Today would be no different. Before she could open her briefcase, Judge Prescott waved a hand dismissively without fully looking up. "Where is the prosecutor?" he barked, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. "We're not wasting the court's time waiting for people who don't belong here." For a moment, a strange silence fell over the room. The air grew thick, charged with something unspoken, a moment on the edge of explosion. Alexis blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line. There it was, the assumption. She could see it in the judge's narrowed eyes, his posture, the casual dismissal in his tone. She had seen it before, and yet, every time, the audacity of it still managed to surprise her. She exhaled slowly, reaching into her briefcase, but she didn't pull out any documents just yet. Instead, she spoke. "Your Honor, I am Alexis Monroe, State Attorney for the 6th Judicial Circuit." The words cut through the silence like a knife. Judge Prescott's bushy gray eyebrows twitched ever so slightly. He looked up, truly looked at her for the first time, and the confusion on his face was brief but unmistakable. "You?" His fingers curled slightly around his gavel as he shifted in his chair. "You're the prosecutor." His voice was noticeably quieter. Alexis did not blink. "That would be correct, Your Honor." The entire courtroom was watching now. The gallery, the clerks, even the bailiff at the back of the room. Everyone had caught the moment for what it was. Judge Prescott inhaled deeply, straightening in his chair. "Well, Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice attempting to regain the firm tone he always commanded, "perhaps you should have identified yourself properly upon entering my courtroom." A slow, measured blink was Alexis's only reaction. "Are you suggesting that the state attorney must announce her presence in a court of law before she is permitted to do her job?" There was no anger in her voice, no frustration, only calm. A calm that was far more unsettling than any outburst could ever be. Judge Prescott clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening slightly around his gavel. The murmurs in the gallery intensified, but Alexis wasn't finished. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining a puzzle. "Or is it that you assumed I did not belong here?" Prescott's jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. For 30 years, his authority had never been challenged, not like this. A challenge was exactly what this was. For the first time in his long career, Judge Carlton Prescott felt something he rarely did in his own courtroom. He felt watched. And for the first time, he felt small. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of Alexis Monroe's presence shifting the very dynamics of the space. Prescott knew he had only two choices: acknowledge his mistake, an admission that would ripple through the entire legal community, or double down. He chose the latter. He straightened his spine, forcing his voice back into its usual commanding tone. "This is my courtroom, Ms. Monroe, and I run it as I see fit. If you wish to present your case, you will follow my rules like everyone else." Alexis inhaled slowly through her nose, pressing her lips together, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, finally, she nodded once. Understood. She turned to her briefcase, unclasped it, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. With deliberate movements, she slid it forward toward the clerk. "Before we proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into the record." Judge Prescott's eyes flicked to the paper, but he didn't reach for it. "And what exactly is this supposed to be?" Alexis met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "A formal motion for judicial review." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Prescott's fingers tightened around his gavel. His jaw clenched. "Judicial review of what?" Alexis folded her hands in front of her. "Of your conduct in this courtroom." A ripple of shock moved through the room. The bailiff shifted uneasily. The court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering over the stenotype machine. Judge Prescott's pulse ticked in his jaw. This wasn't just a subtle jab. This wasn't just an argument. This was a warning. For the first time since she walked into the courtroom, Judge Carlton Prescott looked nervous. The weight of power and truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a routine morning of hearings had now become something else entirely. Judge Carlton Prescott sat rigidly in his chair, his grip tightening around his gavel as the murmurs in the courtroom spread like whispers of a coming storm. A motion for judicial review. His conduct. The words echoed in his mind, each syllable heavier than the last. In all his years on the bench, he had never been challenged like this. Not openly, not publicly. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The clerks, the bailiffs, the attorneys, even the jury from the previous case who hadn't yet been dismissed. Alexis Monroe stood across from him, unmoved, unshaken. She had come prepared, more prepared than he had ever expected. Judge Prescott exhaled sharply through his nose and forced himself to keep his voice steady. "This is unnecessary, Ms. Monroe." Alexis arched a single eyebrow, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of disbelief. "Unnecessary," she repeated. "Your Honor, a judge refusing to acknowledge a case, dismissing the prosecutor before even looking at the charges, is more than unnecessary. It's an abuse of power." A sharp murmur rippled through the room. Prescott's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. The truth hung in the air, suffocating and inescapable. "You assumed I was an intruder in this courtroom," Alexis continued. "Not because I wasn't authorized to be here, but because you didn't believe someone like me could hold this position." The courtroom froze. Judge Prescott's face twitched, his nostrils flaring ever so slightly. "That's a very bold accusation, Ms. Monroe." "I don't make accusations, Your Honor," Alexis said smoothly. "I present facts." She gestured to the document she had placed before the clerk, still untouched. "And the facts here show a pattern of bias. Cases you've dismissed, defendants you favored, prosecutors you've ignored." The murmurs swelled into a low roar. Several people in the gallery shifted forward, eager to catch every word. Judge Prescott's heart pounded against his ribs, but he refused to let it show. This was his courtroom, his bench, his rules. And yet, for the first time, he felt like a defendant standing trial himself. The weight of his reputation, his decades of rulings, his very authority, were suddenly being called into question. He could not let this stand. He had spent his career building an image of untouchable authority, an image that Alexis Monroe had shattered with a single legal motion. "Clerk," he snapped, his voice sharp, "read the motion into the record." A gasp rippled through the room. The young clerk, whose hands had been trembling slightly, hesitated before picking up the document. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read. Motion for judicial review of Honorable Judge Carlton Prescott, filed by State Attorney Alexis Monroe, citing allegations of implicit bias, prejudicial conduct, and repeated dismissal of legal cases based on non-meritorious grounds. Judge Prescott's fingers twitched against his gavel. This was dangerous territory now. Everything he had spent 30 years building was at risk of collapsing in front of him. The whispers in the room grew louder. Even the court reporters hesitated, unsure whether they were recording a trial or a scandal unfolding in real time. Alexis remained unmoved. She had expected this reaction. She had prepared for it. And she was far from finished. The unraveling of power. Judge Prescott's mind raced. How far could he push back before he lost control completely? Could he simply dismiss the motion? Could he silence her? But the problem was bigger than that now. This wasn't just about a single moment of arrogance, a single instance of prejudice disguised as courtroom etiquette. This was about a pattern, and Alexis had the evidence to prove it. Judge Prescott lifted his gavel, preparing to speak, when Alexis spoke first. Before you dismiss this motion outright, Your Honor, I'd like to remind you that the Judicial Oversight Committee will also be reviewing this case. His gavel froze in the air. A sharp silence fell over the room. Alexis continued, stepping forward just enough to make sure every single person in the courtroom could hear her. If you dismiss it, it will only serve as further proof that your judgment is compromised. Judge Prescott's blood ran cold. That was it. The moment he realized he had no way out. If he dismissed the motion now, it wouldn't just be a quiet mistake swept under the rug. It would be evidence against him. If he refused to acknowledge the accusations, it would be national news by the end of the day. And if he continued this case, knowing that he had already exposed his bias, it could mean the end of his judicial career altogether. Alexis Monroe had cornered him, and she had done it without ever raising her voice. Judge Prescott slowly lowered his gavel. His mouth was dry, his hands suddenly feeling too heavy. For the first time in decades, he had no control over his own courtroom, and everyone in the room knew it. He swallowed hard, adjusting his robe as if that small movement could fix what had already been broken. Then, with a voice that was noticeably lower, tighter, he spoke. "Proceed with your case, Ms. Monroe." The courtroom was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They all understood what had just happened. Prescott had lost. And Alexis Monroe, the woman he had dismissed without a second glance, was now the one who held the power in this courtroom. She nodded, collecting her papers as if nothing had happened. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said smoothly. Then, without another glance at him, she turned to the jury, because in this moment, Judge Carlton Prescott no longer mattered. The trial had just begun, but the verdict was already written in the air. The reckoning in the courtroom. The courtroom was silent, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, like the calm before a storm. Judge Carlton Prescott sat stiffly in his high-backed leather chair, his wrinkled hands tightening around his gavel. The instrument that had once been a symbol of his absolute authority now felt like a foreign object in his grasp. The gaze of the room was upon him, but they were no longer looking at him as the unquestioned ruler of this courtroom. They were looking at a man cornered, stripped of his power, and for the first time in decades, they saw him as just another fallible human being, one who had been caught. Alexis Monroe stood at the center of the storm, poised, calm, and completely in control. She had entered this courtroom expecting a fight, but even she had not anticipated that it would come so quickly. Her opponent, the esteemed judge, was already bleeding credibility, and they hadn't even started the actual trial yet. The judicial review motion had been entered into the record. Prescott's choices were limited: either proceed with the case fairly or risk absolute professional ruin. And now it was time to test whether he had learned anything at all. Alexis adjusted the lapels of her suit jacket, a slight movement but one that exuded confidence. Then, without looking at the judge again, she turned toward the jury box, because now This courtroom belonged to her. The case begins, and so does the pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Alexis began, her voice even, steady as steel, "the case before you today is not just about fraud. It's not just about money. It's about something much deeper." She took a measured step forward, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor, commanding attention without demanding it. "This case is about trust, about power, and about what happens when the people entrusted with our resources decide they are above the law." A hushed murmur rippled through the jury box. At the defense table, Wallace Denslow, the man on trial, sat with his high-priced attorney, a man known for getting rich criminals off with little more than a slap on the wrist. Denslow was a real estate mogul, a businessman who had made his fortune promising affordable housing projects that had, mysteriously, never been built. The prosecution had evidence that funds were misappropriated, that Denslow had rerouted millions into private accounts, and that entire communities had been displaced as a result. This should have been an open and shut case. But Judge Prescott had been expected to dismiss it. And if Alexis Monroe had not been the one standing here today, maybe he would have. The defense's game, and the judge's dilemma. Denslow's attorney, a smug, polished man in an expensive suit, stood up after Alexis's opening. He adjusted his tie, flashing a smirk that spoke of confidence and money. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth like a practiced salesman, "what you are going to hear today is a lot of speculation, a lot of theories, but what you won't hear is real, concrete evidence that my client did anything illegal." Alexis did not react. She did not smirk, did not interrupt, did not scoff. She simply waited. The defense attorney knew he had the judge in his pocket. He expected Prescott to throw obstacles in Alexis's way, to block certain exhibits, to rule in favor of Denslow at every critical juncture. But that was before this morning happened. That was before Judge Carlton Prescott had been publicly exposed. Now, everyone was watching him. The press in the gallery, the other attorneys, the bailiff, the court reporters, even the jury was paying close attention to his every decision. And Judge Prescott knew it. For the first time in his career, he felt what it was like to have his own decisions scrutinized. And it shook him. The turning point, a judge forced to play fair. The first moment of true tension came when Alexis introduced the first piece of damning evidence, a forensic audit report that detailed how funds meant for public housing had been diverted into offshore accounts. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, turning toward the judge with an expression so neutral, so unreadable that it only made him more uncomfortable, the prosecution moves to enter Exhibit A into evidence. The moment Prescott hesitated, the entire room felt it. Every second he delayed, every beat of hesitation, made the weight of the public eye feel heavier. He knew exactly what was happening. Alexis Monroe was not just prosecuting Wallace Denslow. She was forcing Prescott to prove whether he was capable of fairness. If he blocked the evidence, the whispers in the gallery would turn into headlines by the end of the day. If he allowed it, it would mean breaking a habit he had carried for decades, favoring powerful men like Denslow over real justice. Prescott exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers tightening around his gavel. "The exhibit is entered into the record," he muttered, barely looking at Alexis. It was a small moment, but it was a shift. The first crack in a stone fortress that had stood unchallenged for years. A power shift. A courtroom awakening. Alexis did not gloat. She simply nodded, as if she had expected this outcome all along. But in that single ruling, the courtroom had felt the change. Prescott's hesitation, his reluctance, it had not gone unnoticed. The jury had felt it. The attorneys had felt it. And Judge Prescott had felt it most of all. The old game no longer worked. For years, he had been able to control cases like this, to nudge them quietly toward dismissal, to ensure that powerful men never truly faced consequences. But today, that system had broken right in front of him, and Alexis Monroe was just getting started. a silent victory, and the judge's growing fear. As the trial proceeded, Alexis methodically introduced evidence after evidence, witness after witness. Every time Prescott hesitated, the weight of the courtroom pressed down harder on him. Every ruling forced him into a corner, either rule fairly or be exposed again. And by the time the jury began leaning forward, truly engaged in Alexis's case, Prescott knew the truth. This trial was not just about Wallace Denslow anymore. This trial was about him, his legacy, his past decisions, his future. And for the first time, he realized that his time was running out. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping from his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The crumbling throne. The courtroom wasn't the same anymore. Something had shifted, something irreversible. Judge Carlton Prescott could feel it in the way the jury sat forward, truly listening, in the way the courtroom gallery was more engaged than ever before, and most of all, in the way Alexis Monroe commanded the room without raising her voice. She had taken control, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. For the first time in his decades-long career, Judge Prescott realized he was not the most powerful person in his own courtroom. He had tried to dismiss Alexis Monroe, had tried to belittle her, erase her presence the moment she had walked through those grand wooden doors. But now, she was the storm he couldn't stop. And worse, everyone was watching. The battle begins. A system fights back. Prescott wasn't a fool. He had spent years in power, and he knew how the system worked. It had been built for men like him, men who didn't need to raise their voices to silence others, men who could destroy careers with a simple ruling, a minor technicality, a procedural denial. And he had wielded that power for years. So, if Alexis Monroe thought she had already won, she was mistaken. Because Judge Prescott still had weapons left to use. His voice was steady, controlled, as he turned toward the defense attorney, Grant Calloway, a man who had made a fortune defending corrupt businessmen like Wallace Denslow. "Mr. Calloway," Prescott said, his voice carefully measured, "you may proceed with your motion." There it was, a lifeline thrown to the defense at just the right moment. Calloway smirked. He knew exactly what Prescott was doing. And Alexis did too. She didn't react, not outwardly. But she knew that Prescott was trying to regain control in the only way he could now, through legal maneuvering. The defense strikes back. The fight for control. Calloway stood up with the practiced ease of a man used to bending the law in his favor. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution's case hinges on evidence that we believe was obtained through questionable means. We are filing a motion to suppress Exhibit A, the forensic audit report, on the grounds that it was obtained without proper warrants." The room stiffened. Prescott felt a flicker of satisfaction at the sudden ripple of uncertainty in the jury. This was how cases were won, not with facts, but with technicalities. The forensic report was the foundation of Alexis's case. If Calloway could get it thrown out, everything else would crumble. And Prescott had every intention of granting the motion. But before he could speak, Alexis moved. She didn't rush. She didn't react emotionally. Instead, she calmly reached for her briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. She flipped through it deliberately, then removed a single document. Without hesitation, she turned toward the judge, holding it up for everyone to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp but controlled, "this is a signed judicial order authorizing the forensic audit, issued by the Honorable Judge Matthews from the Eighth Circuit." The entire courtroom went silent. Prescott's face froze. Calloway's smirk vanished. The jury leaned forward. Alexis walked, slowly, deliberately, to the court clerk's table and placed the document down with precision. Then she turned toward Prescott. That order was signed 6 weeks before the forensic audit took place. So, respectfully, Your Honor, the defense's motion to suppress is completely without merit. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Prescott felt his stomach tighten. He had been prepared to rule against her, but now he had no legal grounds to do so. And everyone in the room knew it. His fingers twitched around his gavel, his mind racing for a way out. But Alexis wasn't done. The judge's trap, and Alexis's escape. "And, Your Honor," Alexis continued, her voice steady, "before a ruling is made, I'd like to remind the court that there is precedent for immediate dismissal of baseless suppression motions under Procedural Rule 12(6). Prescott's jaw clenched. She had outmaneuvered him. He could see it in the gallery's reaction, the jury's newfound attentiveness, the reporters who were scribbling faster than ever. If he ruled in favor of the defense now, against a legally authorized audit, he wouldn't just look biased. He would look corrupt. And that was a stain he couldn't afford. Slowly, with an unbearable tightness in his chest, Prescott spoke. "The defense's motion to suppress is denied." Calloway's face twitched in frustration, but Alexis simply nodded. The battle had been won, and Judge Prescott had lost control again. The defense's desperation, and the jury's awakening. With the forensic audit now officially in evidence, Alexis wasted no time. She called her first witness, a whistleblower from Denslow's company, a former accountant who had been ordered to alter financial records to hide the stolen funds. The jury listened intently, their skepticism shifting into genuine interest. The more Alexis spoke, the more undeniable the truth became. Denslow had stolen millions. Judge Prescott had almost let him get away with it. And now, the jury was seeing it all unfold. The realization, a judge on trial. As the trial progressed, Judge Prescott felt something new creeping into his mind. Fear. Not fear of Alexis Monroe. Fear of the truth. Fear that, once this trial ended, there would be no going back. The reporters in the gallery were already writing their stories. The other judges, the attorneys, even the bailiff, they had all seen how easily his authority had crumbled when faced with someone who refused to be dismissed. The entire foundation of his reputation was shifting beneath his feet, because now, for the first time in his life, he was the one being judged. The collapse of a corrupt throne. Judge Carlton Prescott could feel it happening. The slow erosion of his control, the crumbling of the power he had wielded for so many years. And yet, he could do nothing to stop it. His fingers tightened around his gavel, the familiar weight of it now feeling foreign, almost meaningless. The courtroom had become something else. It was no longer his domain. It belonged to Alexis Monroe now. She had outmaneuvered him, outflanked him, stripped him of his usual tactics, and done so without breaking a sweat. The jury, once complacent, now leaned forward, fully engaged. The gallery, once silent spectators, had now become active witnesses to a judicial reckoning. And Prescott, for the first time in his entire career, he was afraid. The evidence that changed everything. Alexis Monroe did not pause to savor her victory. She had no time for that. Instead, she turned toward the jury, letting the moment breathe, letting them absorb what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the thick, tense air, "we now have confirmation that the forensic audit was obtained legally. That means the evidence you are about to see is not just speculation. It is fact." She turned toward the clerk. "Please display Exhibit B on the courtroom monitor." A flat-screen display flickered to life, and suddenly, bank records filled the screen. Rows and rows of transactions, numbers, and names appeared, clear, undeniable evidence of fraud. Prescott swallowed tightly. This was the part of the case he had been trying to suppress. This was the part that should have never seen the light of day. The transactions were clear, deliberate, and damning. They showed millions of dollars being siphoned away from public housing funds, being routed through shell companies, landing in accounts linked directly to Wallace Denslow. The room held its breath. The jury stared at the screen, their eyes widening, their posture shifting. They were no longer wondering whether Denslow was guilty. They were wondering how someone like him had gotten away with this for so long. The defendant breaks, and Prescott feels the walls closing in. At the defense table, Wallace Denslow's face turned pale. His attorney, Grant Calloway, sat stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth might crack. Denslow leaned toward him, his voice hushed but frantic. "You said this wouldn't happen." Calloway's hands curled into fists, but he kept his composure. "Shut up, Wallace." Denslow's panic was visceral, contagious. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his breathing growing shallow. He had believed, like so many others before him, that this case would never go to trial. That even if it did, Prescott would bury it, dismiss it quietly, and let him walk free. But now he could see it, the way the jury was looking at him, the way the courtroom had turned against him. He was losing, and so was Judge Carlton Prescott. A final desperate move, the defense's last gambit. Calloway was no fool. He knew the case was slipping away, and when the prosecution had the jury's attention, there was only one way left to shift the momentum. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice cut through the room, sharp and urgent. Alexis remained still. She had expected this. Prescott looked at Calloway, knowing exactly what was coming. A lifeline. A desperate, last-ditch effort to stop the case before it was too late. "On what grounds?" Prescott asked, though his voice lacked the usual weight of command. Calloway straightened his tie, taking a steady breath before delivering the line he had been saving for this exact moment. "Your Honor, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial on the basis of prosecutorial misconduct." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The defense's move was clear. If they couldn't win the trial, they would destroy it before it reached a verdict. A mistrial would mean weeks, even months of delay. By the time the case restarted, they could find ways to manipulate witnesses, suppress evidence, exhaust the prosecution's resources. It was a power move, a way to cheat the system, and they were counting on Judge Prescott to grant it. The judge's moment of reckoning. Prescott felt his pulse in his throat. This was his moment. This was the moment they had always expected from him, to do what he had done so many times before, to dismiss the case, to grant the mistrial, to save the powerful man at the defense table. And yet, he couldn't. Not this time. Not with so many eyes on him. Not with the press ready to turn this into a national scandal. Not with Alexis Monroe standing there, watching him, knowing exactly what he was thinking. The room waited. The seconds dragged. Prescott could feel Calloway staring at him, expecting the easy ruling. But then, in that unbearable silence, a realization hit him. Even if he granted the mistrial, it wouldn't save him. He was already damaged, already exposed. This case had not just put Wallace Denslow on trial. It had put him on trial too. And he had already lost. His fingers tightened around the gavel, his jaw clenching. For once in his career, he made the only decision he truly had left. Motion for a mistrial is denied. The courtroom exploded in noise. Gasps. Murmurs. Journalists scrambling to take notes. Calloway's expression cracked for the first time, pure disbelief flashing across his face. Denslow stared at Prescott in shock, his lifeline yanked away in front of his eyes. Even the jury reacted. They knew what had just happened. Prescott had refused to save the man who had expected to walk free. For the first time in years, Prescott had no control. And Alexis Monroe knew it. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply nodded, as if this was exactly how it was always meant to be. The final shift. A judge no longer in power. Judge Carlton Prescott felt his own world shrinking. This courtroom had once been his kingdom, a place where his word was law, where no one questioned him. But today, it had become his own undoing. Wallace Denslow was going to trial. The forensic audit was admitted into evidence. The mistrial had been denied. And the jury, the one group he had counted on to be passive, uninvolved, was now wide awake, seeing the truth for the first time. Prescott could already hear it, see the aftermath forming. The whispers in the legal community. The questions from journalists. The possible judicial review looming over his career. His throne had cracked, and Alexis Monroe had been the one to break it. She gathered her papers, ready to continue. The case was far from over. But one thing was now certain. The game had changed, and Judge Carlton Prescott, he was no longer the one holding the pieces. The final trial, when justice can no longer be denied. The courtroom no longer belonged to Judge Carlton Prescott. He sat there, still wearing his black robe, still holding his gavel, still towering over the room from his elevated bench. But the power he once wielded so effortlessly, it was gone. It had been slipping through his fingers for hours, for days, ever since Alexis Monroe had walked into his courtroom and refused to be dismissed. Now the weight of the entire system bore down on him. The reporters in the gallery were no longer just covering a trial. They were documenting the fall of a judge who had ruled unchecked for decades. The attorneys in the room were no longer just watching the case unfold. They were watching the new balance of power take shape. The jury was no longer passive. They were awake, engaged, and deeply invested in the truth. And Wallace Denslow, the powerful real estate mogul who had expected to walk free, now looked like a man who had realized, too late, that the world was no longer rigged in his favor. His expensive defense attorney, Grant Calloway, had run out of tricks, out of stall tactics, out of lifelines. The end was coming, and everyone in the room could feel it. The final blow, a witness who couldn't be silenced. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Olivia Grant to the stand. Alexis Monroe's voice rang through the courtroom, and for the first time in hours, Wallace Denslow truly reacted. His eyes snapped to his attorney, and for the first time since the trial began, he looked afraid. Calloway whipped his head toward Alexis, visibly tense. Prescott felt it, too. A shift, a move he hadn't expected. Olivia Grant was the key. She was Denslow's former financial officer, the one who had been responsible for signing off on the transfers. The woman who had, until now, remained silent, too afraid to speak out against her former boss. Until now. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman stepped through. She was tall, poised with an air of quiet authority. But there was something nervous about the way she held herself. She was walking into dangerous territory, and she knew it. Olivia Grant had once been loyal to Wallace Denslow. Now she was about to testify against him. She took the stand, was sworn in, and settled into the seat. The courtroom was silent. Then Alexis stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Ms. Grant, can you tell the court what your role was in Wallace Denslow's company? Olivia swallowed, her hands tensing in her lap. Then she nodded. I was the chief financial officer for Denslow Properties. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alexis nodded, encouraging, patient, but firm. And during your time as CFO, were you responsible for overseeing financial transactions related to public development funds? A hesitation. Then finally, Olivia exhaled sharply. Yes. Alexis stepped closer to the witness stand, her eyes never leaving Olivia's. And in your role, did you witness any illegal financial activity? Silence. The tension stretched. Then, Olivia took a deep breath. Yes, Wallace Denslow personally ordered me to move money out of the development funds into private accounts. I knew it was illegal, but he told me it was how the business worked. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs, shocked whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. Even members of the jury exchanged glances. Prescott felt his entire body stiffen. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. Wallace Denslow was no longer a businessman accused of fraud. He was a criminal caught red-handed. And now, there was no saving him. The desperation of a doomed defense. Calloway jumped to his feet, panic flashing in his eyes. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. Prescott latched onto the moment, his chance to regain control. Sustained, he said, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Ms. Monroe, rephrase your question." Alexis didn't even flinch. She simply nodded, as if she had expected this. "Of course, Your Honor." Then she turned back to Olivia. "Ms. Grant, did Wallace Denslow give you specific instructions regarding how to hide these transactions?" Olivia nodded immediately. "Yes. He told me to route the money through a series of holding companies, then move it into offshore accounts so that no one would be able to track it." More gasps. The jury was locked in. They weren't just listening now. They were believing. Calloway was losing control, and he knew it. But Alexis, she was just getting started. The closing argument that broke the system. After 3 days of testimony, of witness after witness, of document after document, the case had been decided before closing arguments even began. But Alexis Monroe wasn't about to let it end quietly. She stepped forward one last time, facing the jury. Her voice was calm, deliberate, unwavering. What happened in this courtroom wasn't just about fraud. It wasn't just about stolen money. It was about power. She let that sink in. For years, people like Wallace Denslow have believed they could manipulate the system, hide behind wealth, use legal loopholes to escape consequences. And why wouldn't they believe that? Because, for years, it worked. She didn't look at Judge Prescott. She didn't have to. Everyone knew what she meant. But today, the system has a choice. She turned, her gaze piercing, unshakable. "Are we going to prove them right?" She gestured toward the rows of bank records, the signed orders, the witness testimonies. "Or are we finally going to hold them accountable?" Silence. Powerful. Unbreakable. Then, Prescott cleared his throat, gripping his gavel. His voice was tight, controlled, hollow. "The case is now in the hands of the jury." The verdict that shook the court. It took the jury only 3 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. Wallace Denslow sat at the defense table, his face drained of color, his hands clenched. The gallery erupted, not in celebration, but in relief. For the first time, a man who was supposed to walk free was held accountable. And Judge Carlton Prescott. He banged his gavel, but no one really cared anymore. He had become a relic of a broken system, a judge who had lost the power he had abused for so long. As Alexis Monroe packed up her briefcase, she didn't spare him a glance. She had done what she came to do. And the system, it would never be the same again. The fall of a judge, the rise of justice. The gavel slammed down, echoing throughout the courtroom. Court is adjourned. But the words felt hollow. Judge Carlton Prescott had spent 3 decades ruling over cases, delivering verdicts that shaped lives, destroying some, sparing others. Today, however, the verdict that mattered most wasn't the one he had delivered. It was the one delivered upon him. The trial had been a storm, and he had barely survived it. The jury had spoken. Wallace Denslow, a man who had once walked through this world untouchable, was now a convicted felon. And Prescott, he felt the weight of his own judgment crushing down on him. Because this trial had not just been about Denslow's corruption. It had been about his. The courtroom emptied, reporters racing out, their notebooks filled with headlines that would shake the city. Jurors whispered amongst themselves, some glancing back at Prescott one last time, as if seeing him for what he truly was, a man who had failed his duty. But the one person who didn't look back, Alexis Monroe. She had walked into his courtroom a prosecutor. She had left it as something greater. The aftermath. The fall of Judge Prescott. Judge Prescott sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a lead coffin. He had thought, for years, that he was untouchable. He had thought his actions, small dismissals here, quiet rulings there, were insignificant, just part of how the system worked. But Alexis Monroe had exposed him. And now, the world was watching. A sharp knock on the door made him flinch. It swung open, revealing Elliot Carmichael, the state's judicial oversight investigator. Carmichael stepped inside, a thick folder in his hand, his expression unreadable. Prescott straightened, forcing himself to sit tall, to project the authority he still had left. But Carmichael's next words sent his world crumbling. "Your Honor, the Judicial Qualifications Commission has formally launched an ethics investigation against you." Silence. Cold, crushing silence. For decades, Prescott had been the one delivering sentences, deciding fates. Now, he was the one under scrutiny. Carmichael dropped the folder onto the desk. "We'll be in touch." Then, just like that, he was gone. Prescott stared at the folder, his hands shaking. The investigation would unearth everything, every questionable ruling, every case dismissed, every defendant who had walked free because of his influence. It would not end quietly. This was not just the end of his career. This was the end of him. The world reacts. A system on trial. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Judge Prescott under investigation following landmark conviction. Judicial oversight launches probe into courtroom corruption. The woman who took down a corrupt judge. Alexis Monroe's victory. Talk shows debated it. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from Prescott, pretending they had never played golf with him, never shook his hand. Defense attorneys, prosecutors, clerks, everyone in the legal world whispered about it. The system had protected men like Prescott for years. But now, the walls were crumbling. The woman who refused to bow. Alexis Monroe stood in her office, staring at the growing pile of interview requests, speaking invitations, political endorsements. The media wanted to talk to her. Politicians wanted her on their side. Activists wanted her to take this momentum and tear down the entire corrupt system. But Alexis, she just wanted to get back to work. As she sifted through files for her next case, her office door creaked open. Her assistant, Lena, peeked inside. "Alexis, someone's here to see you." Alexis frowned. "Who?" Lena hesitated. "Prescott." Silence. For a brief moment, Alexis was genuinely surprised. Then her expression hardened. "Let him in." The last conversation. The judge and the prosecutor. Judge Carlton Prescott entered, not as a powerful man, but as a man on the brink of collapse. His robes were gone. His usual arrogance was gone. He looked older, as if the weight of his sins had finally caught up to him. "I came to talk," he said, voice strained, quieter than she had ever heard it. Alexis sat back, arms folded. "Then talk." Prescott hesitated. For the first time, he didn't know what to say, how to spin this, how to control the room. So he did something he had never done before. He told the truth. "I spent years believing I was doing the right thing," he admitted. "That I was just following the rules the way they had always been followed." Alexis said nothing. She let the silence weigh on him. Prescott exhaled sharply. "I see now that I was part of the problem. But I can't go back and fix it." He looked at her, something almost like regret in his eyes. "But you can." Alexis narrowed her gaze. "What are you asking me, Judge?" Prescott straightened, his hands resting on her desk. "The system needs to change." He took a deep breath. "And I want to help you do it. The future of justice." The offer hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Prescott, a man who had spent his entire career upholding the very corruption Alexis had fought against, was now offering to help her dismantle it. The irony was almost laughable. But Alexis didn't laugh. She studied him. She saw a man who had fallen from power, who had lost everything, but who had finally, truly, seen the truth. And though she didn't trust him, not yet, she also knew something else. Change didn't come from taking down one man. Change came from tearing down the system itself. She tapped her fingers on the desk, then, finally, spoke. "We'll see." Prescott nodded, understanding. He had to prove himself now. As he turned to leave, Alexis spoke one last time. "You built a broken system. She leaned forward, her gaze sharp as a blade. Now let's see if you have the guts to help fix it. Epilogue. The reckoning continues. Months passed. Judge Carlton Prescott resigned from the bench in disgrace. Wallace Denslow was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. And Alexis Monroe. She became something more than just a prosecutor. She became a symbol of the fight for justice, a woman who had stood up to power, won, and refused to stop. More cases were reopened. More corrupt officials were investigated. And in the courtroom where she had once been dismissed, where she had once been waved off like an unimportant figure, now, when she walked in, everyone stood up. Because they knew. Alexis Monroe wasn't just another attorney. She was the woman who had changed the game forever.